Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open-source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We are looking for high-quality guest suggestions for our Enterprise Security Weekly podcast to fill our upcoming recording schedule. We're committed to educating and providing entertainment for the InfoSec community, and we would love to hear from you about who you would like us to interview on the show. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and submitting the form. We review suggestions monthly, and we will reach out to you once reviewed. Join Qualys for VMDR Live on April 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern for a live demonstration of the game-changing vulnerability management detection and response offering, a unified solution that integrates vulnerability management, threat prioritization, and patching in a single app. Register at securityweekly.com/VMDR2020. Well, Matt, John, Zoom remains in the news, and I did want to continue on it as an application security case study, because I thought it was kind of interesting, especially from a product security, application security perspective, in the sense of how do you handle a little bit of crisis management, but also how do you approach and respond to security concerns, and as well as another dimension, how do you introduce defaults that are helpful for the end user? And we talked a lot about defaults with Brad just in the previous segment. So I think that seems like another thing that would be interesting to touch on here. And one of the things I did want to highlight is that, or I guess two things. One, Zoom didn't make a blog post about how they're responding, how they're highlighting security and security changes for their end users to make it less of, so they don't have to do anything and they'll benefit from those defaults. So that's good. The other thing is that Mudge from At Stake fame, he is part of the Cyber ITL. He and some others launched that several years ago. I can't quite remember the year. But cyberitl.org, it's basically an organization that's looking at software from a kind of a bill of materials, or how has it been built type of perspective. And they're looking at browsers, operating systems, and saying, are they taking advantage of all the latest compiler tweaks, all of the latest security features that can be built in, like ASLR, DEP, those types of aspects. And Mudge, on a Twitter thread, took a look at some of the aspects of Zoom and made some good points about the Linux client be lacking a lot of very basic compiler security options that could have been enabled to harden just how it's built. While he was also commenting on other positive things that Zoom has been doing to change defaults and responding to a lot of these issues. So I thought from that is really, I think, instructive, informative for a lot of others to step back for a second and look at how they're building their own software. And if they're especially using compiled languages, if they're using Xcode, GCC, LLVM, or on Windows, VS Studio, in the best ways that they could be for building their code.
Oh, where do you start? Oh my gosh, it's been an interesting couple of weeks. I mean, look, they've made some really good improvements here, and we use Zoom a ton. We use it to bring in all of our remote guests. We use it for all of our meetings. You know, we've enabled a lot of the new security features by default, so the passwords, are enabled by default now. I think my one concern with the passwords is the link is still. The password is embedded in the link. It's hashed. So, you have to have the right ID number and the right password hash. But by keeping aspects of things like passwords in the links, you can still do some level of war dialing because you can run through various iterations. So yes, it's better, but there's still a couple things there. I think the interesting news, that they announced is bringing Alex Stamos on as an advisor to help them through this period. I mean, look, Alex, he has a ton of creds in the space. I mean, from his days at Facebook. Part of the reason why he left Facebook due to a lot of the security privacy concerns that faced Facebook, and he didn't agree with where some of that stuff was going. I think that's a good move by Zoom to bring somebody in like Alex, who definitely takes this very, very seriously when we talk about security and privacy issues. So I think that's some good moves by them, and I think they've done some really good things over the past couple of weeks to enable better security feature functionality. But the challenge with Zoom at the end of the day, I still think is, what you use the service for is to people who don't really necessarily understand how technology works. And so they've made it easy to use. And sometimes when it's easy, it's not necessarily secure. So this is still a little bit of a challenge for them, I think.
Yeah, I saw something over the weekend. I'm trying to be polite in my words here. Someone, I couldn't remember how big or small this is, but someone out there they'd come out with a secure way to do video conferencing. And they're like, yeah, we've tested it on Firefox 63 for Linux, on like ICE and one or two other browsers, which no one's heard of. And I'm like, congratulations. No one's going to use your whatever you wrote. But what's interesting is, so the Alex thing to me, yeah, I have huge respect for him. I consider that a PR move. And whether or not what I'm about to say, what I realized after the podcast last week, I know their head of security. Dude's got a great background. He's done a bunch of good stuff at some other large web conferencing companies. So I got the funny feeling that they were already doing a lot of good work. And there's an example of maybe some things were missed. Maybe there was priorities going on. But I'm not going to say that. I'm going to limit what I'm saying, but I think it's a good example of even a company with some good folks in it. You're still going to run into some of this. So yeah, it's I don't know. You had some more interesting links in here on this, Mike, about some of the lawsuits going on around it, and some of the directions where people are all sort of hand waving, and I'll let you keep talking.
Yeah, I think I didn't want to talk too much on this particular subject, but some of the other links I pulled out where I think kind of ties into the challenge of what you were alluding to there at the end there, John, about building large software that's complex is hard and it's difficult to secure. We heard that just in Kubernetes, if they're running roughly every 90 days a minor release, it's actually adding features and adding consequential features that change the security model or are interfering or changing how security tooling, third-party tooling works. That's consequential right there. And we've seen, all the browsers I mentioned last week that I think it was 2 out of the 3 browsers had an RCE, and the other one had a user interaction required for RCE. So as well as there's a long history of looking at Android. Again, a software that's perhaps easy to use, but doesn't have a great security ecosystem around it, considering patching, unless you're on a stock Google provided, a Pixel with Google update provided updates and so on. So there's a lot of these nuances that it is hard for a security team to keep up with and keep focused and do the right thing for the entire population of users. Rather than just what's on the latest and greatest updates. And I think that just ties into Matt's point too about making software usable also still has to be a balance of how do we manage those security faults, which will be the phrase of the day, and make it usable, because that's what people want to use at the end of the day is the software that works for them and the software that everyone else is using. It's sort of that network effect that we've seen on other IM systems, social media systems. And again, I'll just add too, seeing Alex Stamos come aboard I think will be good. He's also been a great proponent of end-to-end encryption. So I think there he'll also help improve a lot of the communication around that, as well as improve a lot of the encryption on there. It'd be great to see them pull in Whisper systems and just have the the Signal folks consult on building up their encryption model as well. So it'd be fun to watch that. And I think it's a really interesting case study to learn and review and see how would this apply or not apply to the products you're building. And I'm going to use that to segue into another interesting write-up, this time in Slack, which is probably, again, another productivity tool that pretty much most businesses are going to be using, or at least or individuals are using for gaming or just for their personal reasons. This was, in fact, a vulnerability in a turn server. And it's actually an old vulnerability. It was discovered initially around end of 2017, beginning of 2018, but it was only just written up recently. And I did want to highlight it because it's a really nice write-up by this group that talks through how they looked at this basically software or this protocol that's used to bypass NATs designed for WebRTC, basically web conferencing, if you will, in this case, just text chatting, but abusing it to get to the infamous AWS metadata service. So they got into that 169.254 and then could pull IAM credentials. And we saw a very similar thing like that happen with Capital One. So it's just for those reasons, it's just an interesting aspect to look at for other vulnerabilities that are happening in our productivity tools on our laptops.
Yeah, what were we talking about last segment about how hard it is to apply traditional network security into these highly distributed containerized applications? Here's kind of another kind of example of, yeah, it's really, really hard because you have these different services that are out there and you've got vulnerabilities in them, and then all of a sudden you're allowing access to something you didn't even know you could do, let alone figure out how to prevent it.
And it's also, and speaking of drawing NAT into this equation, NAT's the interesting aspect to it as well, because both stun and turn, to use the acronyms or for the two protocols that are used to basically work around NAT so that peer-to-peer devices can talk to each other more effectively. Partially, we have NAT because IPv6 hasn't quite appeared yet. But even if we were to say, well, we're moving on to IPv6, it gets rid of a lot of the reasons for NAT, there's still security and privacy issues around that itself. So again, it's not like we can point to one particular direction or one particular solution, say, just do this and all your problems go away. It's just that now you have different problems, and maybe your environment, your security posture is better now, and you're better protected against certain vulnerabilities, but maybe you're not. So I always think it's a good conversation to have about how complex these are. Another article I had, switching gears a bit, but again, talking about the future of security. Cloudflare had an interesting post, and I always like reading Cloudflare's security or engineering posts because they're well written and they have some good meatiness to them, if you will. In this case, they were talking about moving from reCAPTCHA from Google to HCAPTCHA to basically another provider. Which on one hand is just moving from one poor solution to the problem of blocking bot or inauthentic behavior to another poor solution of doing this, because no one likes clicking on the street lights, clicking on crosswalks and saying, yes, I'm not a bot. What's interesting, though, is near the end of it is they're saying two things. One, they want this service to continue, so they're actually going to pay for it. So that's good if you're a security provider out there. But the other thing is that this is just switching from one CAPTCHA to another. They acknowledge is not the best solution. They still are working on what are the ways that we can not have to engage the users to click on images just to prove that they're not a bot. And so seeing that tag at the end, I just thought was very nice in terms of understanding that this is annoying for users, and there's got to be a better solution out there. So why don't we work on that too?
Yeah, I mean, another solution to this would definitely be warranted and highly desired. But we do have a big problem with a lot of bot traffic. And if you can't differentiate between bot traffic and user traffic, we do open up an attack surface. And so I know what CAPTCHAs are trying to do. The problem is users don't like them. And this goes back a little bit to my conversation when we were talking about Zoom. It's about ease of use, right? Users don't like necessarily needing to click all these little things to submit a form or to log in or to do something. And so how do you balance, again, ease of use with security? This is a mechanism we use. It's not the most desirable, but it is trying to solve a very valid concern.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an attempt. It's this is one of those topics that every time me and one of my security researcher buddies comes together for beers, he's got a standing, and if anyone else out there wants to get connected to him, let me know. But he's got a standing thought for like the last probably 5 years. He'd love to get together with a mathematician and do a mathematical proof that CAPTCHAs are useless. So it's like, I think a lot of us know they're breakable, just no one's actually sat down to do it. Hopefully that doesn't happen anytime soon. So Cloudflare can still provide some level of security around this type of thing. I get all the use cases around the bot stuff, but it seems like this one's waiting to fall, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we've already seen too, just using Amazon's Mechanical Turk, just using people to farm that out. So there's definitely a lot of reasons why CAPTCHAs are failures. But I will then, let's turn it around and say there is a little bit of bot behavior that can be helpful for us for security testing. So I have 2 articles here, and one of them, John, made me think of you, because the first one is a blog from Zap, so Z Attack Proxy, how to use it with GitHub Actions to basically have event-driven security testing. So GitHub Actions basically say, if this happens within a particular commit or in your particular deploy pipeline, launch a Zap scanner. And so Zap can be our friendly DAST to go and do some security testing, some dynamic analysis of your web application. And this ties into another article, I think quite nicely, about shift right testing and what the author was calling the emergence of TestOps. And John, this was something that you had kind of ruminated about last week. And I just thought it was interesting and timely to see this come up.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy to see this as well. I think my biggest concern last week when we were talking about this was I don't want to create more workload for folks who are already trying to keep their heads above water. So the first one, the Zap proxy link, it seems more like that's just automating tests which someone has written. The second one's a little bit closer to the hard part is, how do you figure out what that test should be? How can you create that test without having a human come back into the process? But yeah, it's really cool to see people are actually thinking about this and going down this path.
Yeah, we did talk highlight
about. Yeah, I was going to say we talked a lot about this last week around the OWASP stuff and Zap proxy, right? But one of the things we know that if we write better tests and include security tests in those, we actually can automate a lot of this as part of our CICD pipeline. I think the challenge is, to John's point, what are the right tests? Basic tests like just validating login, right? I mean, we found an error in our own application where we just set it to always true. It didn't matter what username and password you gave it because it was in testing. Well, that ended up going into production. So there are simple security tests that you can write and perform that really validate things along the process. And this is that whole concept of interactive testing that we were talking about last week. If you can do it in a highly efficient way, then you can really test out these applications in a much better way prior to releasing them into production without putting a ton of burden back on the development teams. But there's this interesting balance that has to happen.
Yeah, well, if you think about, refocus my thought there a little bit. If you think about what we're trying to do here, right? Is you can buy something off the shelf, but what we're trying to do is, or at least the thought I had was, how can we test the stuff which is unique to a company where you don't have a turnkey thing out there, right? If you think about when you're going to pick either a Zap or, think off a few of the commercial guys out there on the DAS side, usually one of the reasons that you're picking one over another, besides just price, is how complete is their test suite, right? How good are they at testing all those type of things? You can say, oh, let's just do fuzzing, but for those who haven't actually done it, a fuzzer is sort of useless unless you actually, once again, sort of tune what it's fuzzing and how it's fuzzing. Are you going to try and do a UUID fuzz on a GIF? It's not going to work, right? So that's really, how do you get that sort of knowledge and experience into the pre-test phase is I think where the rubber will hit the road on this stuff.
Yeah, I think you're both highlighting very interesting approaches to this. And for example, there's a big difference between saying, hey, we're the security team, here's a tool, now go do some testing. And here's a tool with something like, here's Zap, go for it. Here is AFL, go do some fuzzing. That's not really setting up the DevOps team for success, because they're like, okay, cool, you gave me a tool, now what do I do with it? And that's really the point you were making, John. And Matt, you were highlighting that IaaS discussion. We were saying that's probably honestly much better if you can get it to work, in the sense that, hey, actually this DevOps team already has a whole bunch of tests for integration, for functionality, for features, for unit testing. What if we just added and instrumented some security aspects on top of that? And that way we're starting with a premise. We know we want testing. We actually have a lot of testing that already happens. Let's instrument it in a successful way for security, rather than just have the security team show up and say, here's a tool, go use this, and then walk away. Because you've really got to hope that DAST or that scanner has some built-in defaults that are going to be able to exercise that login flow, some of the other areas to identify either call them the easy OWASP top 10, basically the input inject some garbage, see how the web application responds. But it's really not going to get into a lot of the really important workflows and features where you need to click on A, click on B, set up some type of state that then you could abuse that as some type of business logic.
Yeah, I mean, DAST has its place when you have existing applications that have not gone through this kind of process, and you need to go validate against the OWASP top 10 or pick your set of tests. But if you're thinking about changing the mentality of how testing and security happens in a CI/CD pipeline as part of building out your DevOps pipeline, interactive testing and building these test cases and then integrating them into the pipeline is a much better way to do it. And so again, it's going to depend on where your applications are and are they the new way or the old way. But I think what this article on this whole TestOps concept is trying to get out is that you have to think about security testing is part of these new pipelines. And if you do it right, you can actually build a lot more secure code and take a lot of the friction out of the development process.
Yeah, and another example that they use is, if done right, they use Netflix and the concept of like chaos engineering, which Netflix was very well known for with their Chaos Monkey, and then later on Security Monkey as well. It just basically say, we want a really reliable system, and we're just going to make bad things happen and see how the system responds. And it definitely requires a lot of communication and collaboration up front to get buy-in from engineering teams to say, we're actually going to potentially mess with your SLOs and make some pagers go off, hopefully during business hours, so it's slightly less painful, but it's going to happen. And that's definitely an extreme example of this idea of shift right testing. It also does require a very mature organization to have those contracts between security teams, between engineering teams, and also has to have a lot of maturity just to be able to handle that type of very purposeful induced problems and potential outages. So there's some risks, and this isn't the type of thing that anyone should just go and do it, but it is something good to strive for, or to measure yourself on sort of more of a maturity model type of approach as you're thinking about where you're doing the testing within your SDLC.
And final thought on this, it's combining podcasts again. There was I think I mentioned recently, I found the podcast from the CTO of Microsoft, and I'm quickly sort of chewing through theirs. But he had the previous president of Y Combinator on, and one of the books he mentioned was Pandemonium, 1660 to 1886, The Coming of the Machine. And it's sort of, the book talks through people at that point in time being super afraid of the Industrial Revolution. Oh my God, they're going to take our jobs. Sound familiar? But where I'm bringing it back to this is, one of the things at my last place, I was trying to get people thinking about going to a more agile development model where you don't have that separate QA team. But I'm not saying get rid of those people or get rid of that QA team. This is sort of an example, right? If you can have someone, if you have resources there in that org that can start helping you think about how do you write those tests or still become part of the dev team and work through that development cycle or the test part of it, I think that's sort of a really great use for those folks.
Yeah, I have no desire to get rid of the QA team. What I'm saying is have that QA team write the right test and continue to build out the test suite so that every time you're running through builds, you're going back through all those regression tests and validating that code still works and is still secure. I don't want to get rid of the QA teams, right? But that's the fear that some people have, is that it's going to get rid of the QA team. Nah, just integrate them tightly into the process.
Yeah, and that's what that whole theme of DevOps is integrating those roles and responsibilities and figuring out where is it most effective to focus. And I think, John, mentioning books, we've also got another article here, more a book link really. Google published a new SRE book. They actually have several. This one is Building Secure and Reliable Systems. And it's a lengthy one, so it's 500 pages. And I'll have to admit, I didn't get through quite all 500 in the time that it came out last week, or at least I saw the announcement last week until this morning. But it's a great way of learning from guidance, learning from experience of Google, obviously a company that has focused on reliability and focused on scale as well. And I think there's a lot more to talk about here, but I also want to throw in that one caveat that all of Google's problems are not likely to be all of your problems either. So this isn't one of those things this isn't a checklist or a cookbook to take all these recipes and implement them yourself. It's more of which of these areas apply to your environment and which of these areas would apply best to your current culture. Adopt those and don't try to force a 500,000, 1 million system, global data center environment into your 3 to 5 service Kubernetes deployment for the first time.
Mike, what happened? You said you were going to read the first 250 pages, and I was going to read the second 250 pages.
Well, Brad likes his ebook, so here's Index. 3 more that he can add to his collection.
Yeah, this is
exactly.
This is what I'd call. It's not quite as bad as I used to joke. The CCIE study guides; those would be great if you want to go. If you want to fall asleep in the evening, those are great to get you out. This isn't quite that bad, but it's still a meaty read. And what's funny for our listeners is, I think both Mike and I found this independently, and we both sort of were gathering we keep notes, for before we go on air, right? And I was going through typing up a bunch of notes, and I looked down a little bit further, and I saw Mike had a bunch of notes on it too. So that's sort of fun. This is, when I look through the table of contents on it, I don't know how much you actually dug into it, Mike, but if you look through a table of contents, it got me excited. Okay, skip part 1. The first 30 pages are sort of useless. But designing systems, design trade-offs, design for least privilege, design for understandability was a huge one of mine. Design for changing landscape, design for resilience, mitigating DOS attacks. And then they start going into some case studies around implementation. How does Google do this? Testing code, deploying code. The deploying code chapter is actually really good. Disaster planning. So a lot of planning, a lot of design, a lot of, if you don't get the point already, the idea here is start thinking about this stuff sooner rather than later, right? I think we've been talking about that a lot today. I wouldn't recommend reading it cover to cover. They don't. I think in their intro, they say, hey, read first few chapters, get a sense for what we're talking about, and then dive into where your interests are. But I think it's a good for sort of helping drive home some points. Probably a good book to quote to management. Hey, this is how Google's doing it. I know the love of my life last year was looking at how Google has a book on test, and she was using that to talk to some of her internal company at the time about how they should be doing tests. So for executive types, this is sort of a really great thing to be able to quote out to others, this type of book. But an interesting read, and hey, it's free, right? So, head out to the link, download a copy, browse through it over coffee, and see what you get from it.
Yeah, and I think to your point too, it's not just a book on here are some configuration settings or here are some very technical design patterns. It even has chapter 21 is even talking about the organization and culture. So it talks about what does it actually mean to approach this? How do you approach this? How do you, for example, they have an entry called Culture of Yes, meaning how do we move away from the late 90s, early 2000s idea of AppSec being no, don't do that, or AppSec being the gatekeeper to let's just make security an emerging part of the DevOps process, as well as how to handle trade-offs, how to approach these, and how to have those conversations with your bosses. So you don't even just have to say, well, Google's doing it, we should do it ourselves. There's some a little bit more insight and ways you can actually approach that conversation. So for many reasons, I like this book. It's just going to take a while to get through.
Yeah, I think there's a tiny bit in there of hey, by the way, I'm saying good things about Google, so don't think it's all bad. But there's a little bit of sort of the Google culture, the not good Google culture, rears its head in a few places. They've done a lot of great stuff. They're got a lot to be proud and brag about. But I really liked also the use cases, sort of like, hey, I think it was the Chrome one in the DOS, no, not the DOS chapter, the next one, the deployment chapter. But there's a few of these examples of like how would a Google team engage that SRE earlier, and obviously they're really big into this SRE concept, right? But sort of walking through how they did that type of thing. So I like that about it as well.
Yeah, it's always fun to learn from examples. And if we throw back to the first segment, I think one of the things that, specifically Kubernetes seemed to be lacking were lots of good reference examples and standardization for what does this design pattern look like? Or what are some best ways to use this enforcement mechanism? And part of that, to Brad's point, he saw 10,000 GPUs being run at once, as well as here is a really tiny microservice web application, running off of a really small pod. So it's hard to have that universalized, but I think this book does do a good job of using demonstrating through examples, as well as giving those different concepts in the chapter. So it's not just about we're building something like Chrome that takes a couple days to compile, and the only other people who might be interested are everybody building Edge, Safari, and Firefox. No, it's actually about what is complex. What's complex software look like? What are the pieces? How do you deploy this? How do you do testing? How do you do shift right under testing, for example? So I'll basically stop there because I have to read some more of the book to say anything more interesting. So I noticed you've been quiet, Matt. So hopefully it's not because you're reluctant to have a reading assignment for the week, but it's there, so we'll offer it up. And as John noted, it is free.
Yes, I know. I just got to find free time in my schedule to read it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I am glad that you took some time out of your schedule to join us again for this week. We had a good conversation on Zoom. We'll see what happens this upcoming week in the news, but it may be time to turn on to other topics and other good case studies for application security. But thanks, Matt. Thanks, John, for joining us. And thanks, everyone, for joining and listening in. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.